So before we get started, I just want to say thank you to everybody who subscribed. I really appreciate that. And I'm hoping that I can continue to make valuable content for you that will help you with your strength and fitness goals. Right, so moving on, I'd like to work on Strength 102 is what I'm going to call this one. This one's going to go over structural balance, movement selection, and consistency. My goal for this is to teach you how to pick movements that you're going to include in your programs, how frequently you should be doing them in your training, and what that should look like. So in the first one, if you haven't watched that one, you can go back and watch it. We go over just the principles of strength training, general sets and reps, and frequency for how often you want to be doing those specific movements, whether it's upper body or lower body. In this one, we're going to go over how to select which movements you should actually be using, and then with respect to those, how consistently you should be doing and what that should look like. So hopefully this is helpful. It's going to be a little bit shorter than the first one, but it's still going to be valuable information for helping you design a strength program. Another thing that I want to mention before we move forward is this is going to be based primarily off of your primary strength movement. And so this will not go into how to select movements for accessory work and stuff like that. This is going to be your main thing that you're going to be including as the primary focus of your strength program or a strength cycle. So before we go in and select which movement we want to use, it's important to do a little bit of analysis. You want to look at what we're going to call structural balance and just make sure that whatever you're doing is maintaining a healthy balance between the front and back side of you, basically. You want to make sure that you're not back squatting significantly more than you can front squat, because that would probably indicate some sort of imbalance between the front and back of your body. You want to make sure that you're able to pull with a good proportion to what you can press. So basically what we're looking at there is the front of the shoulder about as strong as the back of the shoulder, or at least within a healthy proportion to one another. You don't want to be able to bench press like 300 pounds and hardly be able to do a strict pull-up, or vice versa. If you can do a ton of strict pull-ups and you can hardly bench press any weight, then you probably have some sort of imbalance front to back there. So here are the numbers that we're going to look at for making sure that someone is generally balanced. This is more geared towards CrossFitters in different strength sports and disciplines. This might be slightly different. That percentage for the back squat is just your back squat 1RM. It doesn't have to do with body weight. So I know there was some confusion about that when I made some Instagram content about this. People were asking if that was percent of body weight. No, it's going to be just what your back squat 1RM is, right? And so in this instance, let's say you're a guy, you have a 400-pound back squat, then your deadlift would be 125% of that, which is going to be like 500 pounds, right? For the front squat, you'd be looking at being able to front squat 85 to 90% of 400, because in our example, that's how much you can back squat. Bench press, you'd want to be able to bench press about 90%. For CrossFit, I actually think that this number is a little bit high. I got these numbers from Sam Smith, who is a pretty well-known and very experienced CrossFit coach in the space. I think that 90% is a little bit high. I would be surprised if more than half of the CrossFit Games athletes were able to bench press 90% of their back squat. I think it's a good target to go and hit. I honestly think that once you can bench press for men 315 to 335 pounds, you're probably fine. It's enough strength and muscle mass in the upper body, in the front delt, in the pecs to be able to do things like strict handstand push-ups, ring dips, ring muscle-ups, that sort of thing. The pull-up, you want to be able to do a pull-up with 1.5 times your body weight. So if you were a 200-pound person, then 1.5 times your body weight would be 300 pounds. So you want to be able to do a pull-up with 300 pounds of total load, which would be 100 pounds of added weight, right? That would be a 1RM pull-up. And then you want to press 65% of whatever your 1RM pull-up is. So if I'm a 200-pound guy, then I want to be able to do a pull-up with 100 pounds added to me, which would mean 300 pounds of total load, which is 1.5 times 200, my body weight. And then 65% of 300 is what I should be able to overhead press. These numbers are also true for women. I believe the only difference here for women is the bench press is probably a little bit lighter. I'd say probably closer to 80%. And then even then it could probably be a little bit lower. And then I actually think that the press and the percent body weight pull up are probably going to hold pretty similar for women. So just as an aside there, all right? So those are what we're looking at for structural balance. If you're outside of the range on any of those, then that's going to be indication that that's a weakness that you want to target with your strength training. So if you can back squat 400 pounds and you can only front squat 295 pounds, then you probably have a relative weakness in your quads, right? And so we want to include a movement in as your primary strength movement in your program that will develop the quads a little bit more than it's going to develop your posterior chain, right? Conversely, if you are pretty good on all of these and you have one movement that's an outlier that's really strong, it's probably a good indication that you don't need to target that movement very much, and you can spend less time training that. So when I'm looking at movement selection, once I've decided kind of what movements I want to include in my strength program based on my personal structural balance, I am using 3 different criteria to select the movement that I'm going to do. So the main 3 criteria that I'm looking for is the stability of the movement, the range of motion of the movement, and your ability to micro-load the movement. And I'll go into all of those in the next couple of slides. So when we're picking a movement that is going to be included as our primary strength driver for a training cycle or whatever movement selection we want to go with for building strength in a program, you want to be using movements that are more stable. In general, lower stability leads to more neural inhibition, and with more neural inhibition, you are limiting the amount of force that your brain will allow you to put through the muscle fibers. So if you were doing a Bosu ball squat, the amount of balancing that you're having to do will basically make your brain not allow you to produce maximal force because it wants to focus on balancing more, right? As you get more stable, you can produce more force. And you can feel this, right? When you do a Bosu ball squat, it's hard to rip through the concentric portion of the squat because you are focusing on balancing, right? When you do a barbell back squat, a deadlift, or even in this example, like a hack squat, you can push really hard, right? And that's because there's very little that you have to think about in terms of being stable. So for this, I like to use bilateral movements. I generally will err more on the side of something with a barbell, at least for CrossFitters. The hack squats are really great assistance exercise, but I think that the systemic load and having a little bit more involvement of the core and the trunk with something like a back squat or a front squat is beneficial and a little bit more sport specific. If I was a bodybuilder or just trying to get my legs as strong as possible and I didn't have to worry about having the world's strongest transverse abdominals and obliques to maintain structure in my, or to maintain a rigid core during a workout like a Metcon, then I think that hack squat is probably better. But in general, lateral movements with a barbell are probably the best option in terms of stability. So the next criteria that I'm looking at for building strength is range of motion. And so whatever strength training that you're planning on doing or including as your main feature in a strength program should take the joint systems through the same range of motion that will be present in a workout. So in CrossFit, they require during a squat that your hips descend below the knees and that you stand up all the way, right? For this reason, I really like to use stuff like front squats because they take the joint system through a similar range of motion, and it's important for your body to be able to produce force and be strong through the range of motion that it will have to go through during a competition event. Something like a ring dip in the ring muscle up, you can use like a bench press. It has, as you can see here, a similar loading pattern, especially a close grip bench press. It's more stable than the ring dip, so you can produce more force through it, but it takes the pecs and the shoulders and the triceps through the similar range of motion that you experience during a ring muscle up. So the final criteria that I look at when I'm selecting a primary strength movement that I'm going to include in a training cycle or a strength program is the ability to microload. So having the ability to really fine tune and adjust how much weight you're using is really important. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of whether or not you're getting better, and it makes it easier to progressively overload week over week. So you can imagine that if I was going to do sandbag bear hug squats for a strength cycle, it's going to be really challenging for me to measure progress and add load continuously week over week when I'm looking at having to make a 50 or 25 pound jump if I want to go up to the next heaviest implement, right? And so I'm looking at I can think of an example. In fact, I've experienced an example with clients before where they're capable of sandbag bear hug squatting the 100 pound sandbag for 10 to 15 reps, and they can hardly do any at 150 reps, right? And when we look at the information from the previous video where we want to be between 3 and 8 reps close to failure, and it's like a 1 RM with 150 pounds or a 15 RM with 100 pounds. There's a better way for us to fine tune the loading with a barbell to get ourselves within that rep range, right? Dumbbells are fine. I think that the lack of stability with a dumbbell compared to a barbell doesn't allow you to produce quite as much force. And you are still having to make 5-pound or combined weight 10-pound jumps. With a barbell, depending on the equipment available to you, you can make smaller jumps week over week. I'm not saying that the dumbbells are a bad choice of movement. In fact, I really like dumbbells for the increased range of motion and the little bit of added stability that is required by the athlete, but I think that they fit more in accessory work that you do after your primary strength movement. So the final thing that I wanted to talk about was the consistency of which you are doing the movement that you select. And for a novice athlete, it doesn't really matter that much. The amount of motor learning that is required, actually, athletes will benefit from a lot of variance in the loading patterns that they're doing for whatever movement it is. And it will help them gain kinesthetic awareness of how to produce force through the movement pattern. Now, once somebody can consistently produce a meaningful amount of force through a movement pattern, and they are an intermediate level athlete, and for most people, this is with 6 years or less of experience with weightlifting, they will benefit from very consistent movement selection to allow them to get really good and really strong at that specific movement. So if you are an intermediate level athlete, which is like an open or quarterfinals level athlete, you will benefit from running the same loading pattern of any given movement that you use in your strength work for 16 to 20 weeks at a time. If you are always switching the movement pattern, your brain has to take a little bit of time to relearn how to reproduce force. Your brain has to take a little bit of time to relearn how to produce maximal force with the relatively new loading pattern. So if you switch from a back squat to a front squat, it will take your brain between 2 and 6 weeks to fully feel comfortable producing maximal force in the front squat. For that reason, if you are an intermediate athlete and you stick with a specific movement for longer than 6 weeks, you're getting more time where you are able to produce a lot of force, right? Constantly switching leads to you constantly having to deal with neural inhibition as the body relearns how to generate maximal force through the movement pattern. Once an athlete becomes elite and extremely high level, they've done so many repetitions of all of the different loading patterns that they can reliably switch from one to the other with very little neural inhibition, right? This is like somebody who rode a bike every once in a while, taking 3 years off from riding a bike and getting back on, and they know how to ride the bike still. They don't really forget, but they don't feel super comfortable, versus an elite level cyclist who might take 5 years off from cycling. They get back on the bike and it's like they never left the thing, right? That's what the elite athletes are like. And so if you've done tens of thousands of hours of the specific movement, then you can afford to switch from one to the other and have pretty little neural inhibition that prevents you from producing maximal force. That's why elite weightlifters can just do heavy front squat, heavy back squat, and switch back and forth all the time. If you're an intermediate, you haven't done enough reps of all of the different loading patterns for your body to feel comfortable with doing that while producing maximal force, right? And so as an intermediate, somebody who is an open or quarterfinals level athlete, you should be doing a lot of repetitions with the same movement pattern for significantly longer than what you probably are. And again, that's 16, 20, even an entire year, 52 weeks of the same movement so that you can reliably produce maximal force and thus gain strength faster and get really comfortable and efficient through the movement pattern. So as a summary, when I'm going through building a strength program, the first thing that I look at is structural balance, and that helps me identify if there's specific movements that I need to be focusing on. Once I know the general movements that I need to be focusing on, I want to use a movement that is stable, a movement that takes my body or the joint system through the range of motion that is similar to what it's going to experience at the competition, and it should be a movement that I can micro load so that I can fine tune progressive overload and manage loading during my training sessions. Finally, if you're an intermediate athlete, then you need to be sticking with that movement for a significant period of time so that you can reliably produce maximal force and see the most benefit from your strength training. You're not going to hurt yourself by switching back and forth. You're just not going to optimize the amount of strength that you can gain.